In this lesson, we're going to get started with the study of Pliny's Natural History. Since this is the first lesson in Pliny's Natural History, I'm going to provide an introduction to talk about what Pliny's Natural History is, who Pliny is, how this book fits into the rest of your studies, and why we should study it. All right. The first thing we should talk about is, and we talked about this when we had our introduction to Theophrastus, we talked about philosophy. And I told you that there were three divisions of philosophy. There was rational philosophy, moral philosophy, and natural philosophy. And I told you that the main author on each of these topics, the main author is who? Aristotle. Right. So the main author whose works we study to learn this philosophy is Aristotle. But the problem with Aristotle is that he's very difficult to study. And so you can't start with Aristotle. And I told you that what we do to get started with philosophy in each of these subjects is we begin with simpler studies. For rational philosophy, we start with the study of grammar. For moral philosophy, we start with studies like Aesop's fables and Theophrastus' characters. But in natural philosophy, we start with a subject that's called natural history. And natural history, don't get confused by the word history. It doesn't mean the past. Natural history is just a study of what exists in nature. It's like a study of our observations in nature. Simple nature studies. That's natural history. The problem with the study of natural history, if you remember when we talked about ancient history, we talked about archaeology. We said one of the problems with archaeology is when you observe things, when you find things in the natural world, you have to interpret their meaning. You have to interpret them. You have to figure out, what are they for. For example, if you go out into the gardens and you see all kinds of bugs, it's very weird to think, why do all these bugs exist? Why are there different kinds of birds? Do we really need bluebirds and cardinals and sparrows? Do we really need different kinds of birds? Why are there skunks and possums and raccoons? What are they for? What's their purpose? You go in the garden, like I said, and you find all kinds of worms and slugs and snails. And what are these things for? Why do these things exist? Why do mosquitoes exist? Why do flies exist? Okay, so when we go into the natural world, we find all kinds of interesting stuff. And plants, it's even crazier. There's so many different plants, and there's thorn bushes and weeds, and all kinds of flowers and fruits and vegetables and trees, all kinds of stuff. And we can go around taking pictures, drawing pictures, making lists and lists and lists of all the different stuff we can find. And it would be really amazing how much different stuff there is. But when we step back from that and we think, what's the purpose of all this stuff? Why do these bugs exist? Why do butterflies exist? It gets confusing, and we have to interpret nature. We have to explain why. We have to try to figure out what is the order of these things. Why do they exist? Can we just kill them all? Can we just kill all the mosquitoes and kill all the flies and kill all the sharks? Just kill all the lions, poison all the animals we don't like, and just get rid of everything? Or do we actually need these things? So it's easy to just go and take pictures and get information and watch National Geographic and just learn all kinds of information about all kinds of plants and animals. But we want to know more than that. We want to know, what are these things for? Do these things have relationships with one another? Do we need each other? We want to understand that. So when we study natural history, we want to make sure that we study natural history that's written by or taught by someone that we have similar ideas with. We want to study natural history with someone who shares our religion, our philosophy, and so on. You understand that? We don't want to go out into the backyard with an evolutionist and have him explain everything to us, or with an atheist and have him tell us that everything is just meaningless and we all die and we might as well just kill ourselves because there's no purpose. Right? We want to study natural history with someone who is like-minded with us, who's wise, who can have some interesting observations and comments and can make some interesting notes and teach us about the natural world. So we have to look back through history and ask, is there anyone who's written a natural history who shares our philosophy, who has a traditional or timeless, classical, Aristotelian philosophy, who has studied natural history? And there's not many. But one of them who does exist is Pliny. And so, for the study of natural history, we're going to study Pliny's natural history. Pliny. It's a funny name, but Pliny was a Roman. He lived in the time of the apostles, way back in the 1st century. He lived just after the time of Jesus, when the church was just getting established, when Christians were being persecuted. That's when Pliny lived. Pliny was a very wealthy, famous Roman. In order to study the natural world and travel around and write a book like this, you have to be wealthy to even have the opportunity to do that. Pliny was a wealthy, influential Roman, and he wrote a book on natural history, which is basically a summary of what was known about the natural world at that time. And again, this isn't natural philosophy. This isn't what Aristotle is going to teach us in natural philosophy, where Aristotle is going to explain to us all of the principles of the natural world. That's not what Pliny's doing. Pliny is simply teaching us about what exists in the world. Okay, so you've never been to Africa or Asia. You've never been to Italy. Well, Pliny's going to talk about the plants and animals that are found all over the world, everything that they knew about in the time of the Roman Empire. And it's important that we have a natural history written by the Romans because they controlled the whole world at that time. They knew everything that existed in the world. They did business with every nation. They had government set up in every nation. Their military was in every nation. Their ships sailed every sea. The Romans knew what existed in the world. So it's very helpful for us to study natural history by a famous, influential Roman. And that's what Pliny is. His name is Plinius. Pliny is an English form of his name, Plinius. One other interesting note about Pliny, you don't have to write this down, but one interesting thing about Pliny, just to know about Pliny, is that when we look back into history and we ask, did any Roman people write about Christians? You know, we have all kinds of Christian writings. We have the Apostles' writings in the New Testament. We have the Gospels. We have the writings of early Christians. Did any ancient Greeks or Romans who were alive write about Christians? And the answer is yes. There is an author who did write about Christians, and it was Pliny. In the very beginning of the church, he wrote a bunch of letters, and we still have his letters. You can read them in a book, a collection of all his letters. And in his letters, he's writing back and forth with other Romans, talking about what they should do with the Christians, because there's all kinds of controversy and commotion being caused by the Christians, because they basically took over the world. And Pliny, in his letters, talks about the Christians. So we have some early historical information about the Christians outside of the Bible, which is just interesting for the sake of studying history. Remember, we talked about using written documents to study history. Pliny gives us some source material about Christians outside of Christian writings. So he's interesting and he's useful. And in philosophy, he's helpful to us because he helps us, especially young students, he helps us to get started with natural philosophy. Okay? Now, one question we should ask is, what's the difference between natural philosophy and science? You know, we're going to study modern science. We're going to study biology and physics and chemistry and modern science. What's the difference between science, modern science, and natural philosophy? The answer is that in modern science, we're only supposed to talk about what we can observe, right? It's only about material things, only about what we can observe. That's supposed to be how modern science works. We're only supposed to talk about what we can observe. That's not necessary in natural philosophy. In natural philosophy, we're allowed to bring religion in, we're allowed to bring philosophy in, we're allowed to reason about things, we're allowed to talk about things that are probable. Natural philosophy doesn't limit itself to only things that can be observed. Okay? And that's good for us because the truth about the world can't be limited to just what we can observe. The knowledge of God and of angels and spirits and devils and all other invisible things is important for us to understand the natural world. It's like saying you're trying to understand a man by only studying his body and not studying his soul. How can you understand a man without understanding his soul, right? So it's the same thing with nature. We can't understand the natural world without knowing about God, without using reason and thinking about philosophy. So natural history, I would argue, is more helpful than modern science. Modern science is helpful in some things, and we'll talk about that in modern science, but it's not as helpful as natural philosophy and natural history. So that's why we're studying natural history, and that's why we're studying Pliny. Okay? Now in this book, Pliny's Natural History, let me switch over to the book here. This book written by Pliny is a pretty heavy book. It's serious stuff. There's a lot of information in this book. In the beginning of the book, Book 1, Pliny dedicates the book to the emperor. He writes a long dedication where he basically describes what he's done to put this book together, and he dedicates it to the emperor, to the honor of the emperor. We're not going to study this first part of the book. It's simply a dedication to the emperor. It's really not what we're interested in. But what I want you to look at on page 47 in the document is Pliny writes a table of contents. He writes a list of all the topics that he writes about in his natural history. And I'd like to just walk through that in this introduction so you can see what he's going to write about in this book. Okay? So on page 47 there, this is part of the dedication, so it says dedication at the top of the page. Scroll down halfway to the middle of the page and you'll see there's a section indented and it says, the first book is the preface of the work dedicated to Titus Vespasian Caesar, that is to the Emperor Vespasian. Okay? So when does Pliny live? When did Pliny write? During the rule of the Emperor Vespasian. The first book is just a dedication. We're not going to study that. But if you look, it says the second book, the second is on the world, the elements, and the heavenly bodies. That's where our study is going to begin. We're going to begin in the second book, studying the world, the elements, and the heavenly bodies. Then he goes on and says, the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth books are on geography, in which is contained an account of the situation of different countries, the inhabitants of different countries, the seas, towns, harbors, mountains, rivers, dimensions, the various tribes, some of which still exist and others have disappeared. So one of you, I think, the other day was showing me a map and was saying, isn't it amazing how they used to draw maps in the ancient world? One of you, was that you? And you think about geography in the ancient world, how in the world did they draw maps of the world when they had no airplanes, no satellites, no overhead pictures, no Google Earth? They had to literally sail around the coasts of countries and take measurements and draw the coasts and hope that when they got done, everything fit together and looked right. And sometimes it looked ridiculous. Other times they really nailed it and had it accurately. And our maps today with Google Earth and all this high-tech stuff really doesn't look much different than what they drew by actually walking around, measuring, sailing around, measuring, and drawing. It's pretty amazing. So we're going to study geography, what the Romans knew about the geography of the world. And again, the Roman knowledge is important because they controlled the whole world at that time. They had people all throughout the world. You can imagine all the different countries reported to them and shared information with them. The Romans knew what was going on. In the 7th book, to keep going through this list, the 7th book is on man. The 8th book is on various kinds of land animals. The 9th book is on aquatic animals. The 10th book is on various kinds of birds. Go to the next page. The 11th book is on insects. The 12th book is on odoriferous plants, scented plants. The 13th book is on exotic trees. The 14th book on vines. The 15th book on fruit trees. The 16th book on forest trees. The 17th on plants that are raised in nurseries or gardens, that are cultivated plants. The 18th book is on the nature of fruits and cerealia, that means grains, and the pursuits of the husbandman, that means the work of gardening. That's book 18. Book 19 on flax, broom, and gardening. Book 20 on cultivated plants that are proper for food and for medicine. So we'll study something about what the Romans knew about medicines and how they were drawn from plants. The 21st book on flowers and plants that were used for making garlands. Garlands mean like decorations made out of flowers and plants. Like think about Christmas time, we decorate with pine branches. You know, we make wreaths and things like that. They're used in ancient countries. They were used in worship ceremonies and things like that. If you look at Hindu people, you'll see that Hindus use all kinds of flowers and garlands in their worship. Really amazing, beautiful stuff. But flowers and plants used for making garlands. Book 22 on garlands and medicines made from plants. Book 23 on medicines that are made from wine and cultivated trees. Book 24 on medicines made from forest trees. Book 25 on medicines made from wild plants. So if you want to learn all about how medicines are made from plants, we're obviously going to get into that. And you see the chapters go on all the way down to chapter 31. He's still talking about medicines. But back up to 27, on some other plants and medicines, book 28 on medicines procured from man and from large animals. Book 29 on medical authors, that is, men in the past who had written on medicine and on medicines from other animals. Book 30 on magic and medicines for certain parts of the body. Book 31 on medicines from aquatic animals. Book 32 on the other properties of aquatic animals, animals that live in the water. Book 33 on gold and silver. Book 34 on copper and lead and workers of copper. Book 35 on painting. colors and painters. In other words, how paint can be made with different colors from nature. Book 36 on marbles and stones, book 37 on gems. And that's the end of book 1. So we have a table of contents, and you can see there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. You know? Now, we can study that book just because we're curious. You know? We can say, oh, I'd like to learn about magic, right? I'd like to learn about medicines that come from fish. We have an example of that in the Bible, actually. But there's important reasons why this kind of information is necessary. Why would this be dedicated to an emperor? You know, doesn't that seem kind of weird? Why would you write all this and then say, here, emperor, this is for you? And the answer is because if you think about someone in government, someone in power like an emperor or a king who's got to command an army and basically rule whole countries or even other countries, the rulers have to know how things work. If you're at war and you're in battle, don't you think it's helpful to know where you can find medicines in a forest? It's not just information for fun. It's necessary information. You see what I mean? This is information that people need to know. I mean, nowadays, our research and development, we're thousands and thousands of years into this study of the natural world. We've got things simplified in a lot of ways. When a military medic today just uses medicines that are delivered to the military. But what if they don't have that? What if you're in a jungle in a major war like the Vietnam War and you don't have access to all different kinds of medicines and things like that? That's real life, and we never know what we're going to be forced to do, and this kind of knowledge can come in handy at a time when we have to do things driven by necessity to figure out ways to do things that we might not normally think about. So just having a place where we can go to study and learn about what's there and what's possible is important for us. It's good to be prepared because we never know what's going to come in life. So that's a summary of the content of Pliny's work on natural history. Where are we at time-wise? How many minutes?
22 minutes.
22 minutes? Okay, that's good. All right, so that's a good introduction to Pliny's Natural History. Gives you a good idea of what the book's about, right? A good idea of who Pliny is, why we would read Pliny, why the Romans are a good source for natural history, because they ruled the world and they had access to knowledge about all these different places. So that's why we're studying Pliny's Natural History. I think that's a good overview and introduction for you. So our study is actually going to begin in Book 2. And so I'd like you to turn to Book 2. Take a look at Book 2. You'll see the title of Book 2 is An Account of the World and the Elements. So we're going to learn what the Romans believed or knew about the world, the whole world, what they thought about the world. When we read Genesis chapter 1 and we read God created the heavens and the earth, and he made on the different days of creation all the different parts of the created world, we'd like to see, hey, do the Romans believe that? Did the Romans think that something like that was true? Or do they have totally different ideas about the world? So we're going to read Pliny's account of the world and the elements. The elements means the things from which the world is formed. So let's just walk through this. Chapter 1, let's take a quick survey. Chapter 1, whether the world is finite, whether there is more than one world. And this is a question that scientists today are still arguing about. We sent a rover to Mars. Why did we send a rover to Mars? You know what the rover is? It's like a robot that drives around. It's got cameras and all kinds of tools on it. Why did we send a rover to Mars? The scientists are actually looking to see if there are any signs that anything or anyone ever lived on Mars. So this question that Pliny was asking 2,000 years ago whether the world be finite, whether there be more than one world. Are there aliens? Do people live in outer space? Is there another planet where someone lives or something lives? The ancient Romans asked that same question, and we're still arguing about that 2,000 years later. You know? I mean, Elon Musk thinks that we can go and live on Mars one day. People still aren't sure if the Earth is the only place, is this the only place where there's life? Or is there other life in the world? Are there other worlds? Other whole planets full of creatures living and doing things? Or are we the only one? So, let's read what Pliny has to say. Chapter 1. He says, the world, and the Latin word that he uses for world is mundus, the world and whatever that be, which we otherwise call the heavens, the world and the heavens, by the vault of which all things, sorry, there's so many notes in this book, all things are enclosed, we must think to be a deity. What is a deity? Do you know what a deity is? A god. So Pliny says, and this is interesting, Pliny says we must think that the world and the heavens together is a god. Now, as Christians, we read that and we're like, what is he talking about? The world is a god. Well, that doesn't even make any sense, right? But look at what he says. This is going to explain what he means when he says that the world is a god. It is eternal. Is God eternal? Yes. Okay, so if the world is eternal, is the world like God? Yes, it's eternal, right? To be without bounds, that means there's no limits to the world and to the heavens. It's infinite. It has no bounds. If that's true, is God infinite? Yes. So is the world like God? Yes. It is not created. So he believes that the world, the universe, was not created. It always existed. It was eternal, never created. If that's true, is it like God? Yes, God was not created. Nor subject at any time to destruction. That means it doesn't decay or die. It lives forever. If those things are true, if it's true that the world is eternal, is infinite, was not created, and is never decaying or destroyed, then it's like God. All right? It's like God. So it makes sense for him to say the world must be a God because it has all of the characteristics of God. Now, as Christians, if we were to read that, do we believe that the world is eternal? No. We believe that the world was created. Right? He says the world was eternal and it was not created. So do we agree about that? No. Is it possible, listen to this, is it possible for Pliny to know whether or not the world was created? No. He's a philosopher. All he has to go by is reason. He's not a Christian. Christianity is just spreading through the Roman Empire when he's alive. He's judging the world by what he sees and by what he can reason about the world. As far as he can tell, did the world have a beginning? He has no way to know that. It appears to be eternal. Was it ever created? I don't know. It appears to have never been created. Was it ever destroyed and reborn or something like that? There's no evidence of that. And so based on reason, based on observation, based on what's probable for a philosopher, it looks like the world is eternal. It looks like the world was not created. It looks like the world can never suffer destruction. It's like a god. It lives forever. All right? So that's not a crazy idea. But notice what he says next, because this is important. He says, to inquire what is beyond the world is no concern of man. To inquire what is beyond the world, to ask what's beyond the world, to try to find out what's beyond the world is none of man's business, he says. Nor can the human mind form any conjecture, that is, any idea or theory respecting it. There's no way for man to think of anything beyond the world, and it's a waste of time to do so. So he would argue that what NASA is doing, exploring outer space, sending satellites and all kinds of stuff out into space to go look for things, he says that's a waste of time. Total waste of time. To inquire what is beyond the world is no concern of man, nor can the human mind form any conjecture respecting it. You're not going to come up with any reasonable idea about what's out there except craziness, like aliens, right? And when you really think about alien stories, they don't even make any sense. We just think they're like people or animals that live someplace else. And they're going to show up on planet Earth in some kind of high-tech rocket or spaceship, as if they would even need to use, like, why would they even need to use a spaceship? Like, what's it going to be built out of? It's going to be built out of materials on Earth? It just doesn't even make any sense. It's just silly stories. If you really try to think of what life would be like someplace else, your mind can't even comprehend what it would possibly be like. It doesn't make any sense. Even to think about life on Mars is ridiculous. You know where Antarctica is? You know what it's like on Antarctica? Anybody live in Antarctica? It's just solid ice, right? No, researchers can barely even go there to do scientific research. It's so cold, impossible to live there. That's on our planet. We can't even live on a part of our planet. Mars is way colder than Antarctica. If we can't live on Antarctica, how in the world are we going to live on Mars? You know how we have an atmosphere around our planet, right? There's like it's like a thin layer of gases that surrounds the Earth. You know what the atmosphere is? Huh? If you ever look at a picture of the Earth, you'll see that you see the Earth, the blue and green Earth, and then around the Earth, there's like a cloudy gas circle or sphere that goes around the Earth. It's the air above the Earth. It only goes up so high and then it stops. The satellites and stuff like that are actually outside of the atmosphere. They go around the Earth, around the atmosphere. The atmosphere blocks the sun's rays and allows us to live. On Mars, there's no atmosphere. So if you were to step outside of a spaceship on Mars and the sun shined, it would kill you. Because there's no atmosphere. There's no air on Mars. There's no oxygen. There's no atmosphere. So to talk about living on Mars doesn't even make any sense. And that's what I mean. That's what Pliny means when he says to even try to think about life somewhere else doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. He goes on to say, it is sacred, the world that it is. He says the world is sacred. It's eternal. It's without bounds. It's all in all. It's all that there is the world. Including everything in itself. It is finite, yet it is like what is infinite. Finite means it has bounds, but it's like it has no bounds. The most certain of all things. In other words, the world that we can see, the material world, the heavens, we see them, we can observe them, they are certain. Knowledge of the gods, for him, is not certain. Might be trying to figure out, knowledge of history is not certain. Knowledge of the future is not certain. Knowledge of the world is certain. It's right here. most certain. And yet at the same time, he says, it is like what is uncertain. It's mysterious at the same time. It is externally and internally embracing all things in itself. It is the work of nature, and itself constitutes nature. When the ancient people use the word nature, they mean not necessarily God, but they mean like the wisdom and power of God that makes things the way they are. Okay? Like the nature of a thing. Like a snake, right? What is the nature of a snake? The nature of a snake is to slither and sneak and to bite, right? That's the nature. You don't pet a snake. You know, it doesn't come up and cuddle. It's not like a kitten or like a dog. Snakes are cunning. It's the nature. What's a fox like? The nature of a fox is cunning and sly, right? What's a wolf like? A wolf is a fraudster, right? Deceitful. Those are the nature of the animals. You can't make a pet out of a wild, ferocious animal. People have tried, and usually they get killed by it because the nature of that animal can't be changed. The world is the work of nature, but itself constitutes nature. And I want you to pay attention to this next paragraph because this relates to our studies in science. It is madness to harass the mind. To harass means to bother and to irritate and to trouble. It is madness. You're a crazy person. To harass your mind with attempts to measure the world. And when he talks about the world here, he doesn't just mean the earth, because people had already measured the earth by the time he lived. When he's talking about measure, he's talking about measuring the world and the heavens. Okay? It is madness to attempt to measure the world and to publish these attempts, or like others to argue from what they have made out that there are innumerable other worlds, which modern science tries to say. That it just goes on, and there are more and more galaxies and more planets and stars and suns and moons, and it just goes on and on and on. It's madness to suggest that. And that we must believe there to be so many other natures, or that if only one nature produced the whole, there will be so many suns and so many moons, and that each of them will have immense trains of other heavenly bodies, as if the same question would not recur at every step. It'll just keep going on and on forever if that was true. Anxious as we must be to arrive at some termination, or as if this infinity, which we ascribe to nature, the former of all things, cannot be more easily comprehended by one single formation, especially when that is so extensive. We can't even explore our own country. We haven't even explored the oceans on our own planet, and yet men talk arrogantly with some kind of confidence, like they've got the heavens all figured out. We haven't even explored the oceans on our own planet. We don't know about the world. It's madness, he says, perfect madness, to go out of this world and search for what is beyond it. It is madness to go out of this world and search for what is beyond it, as if one who is ignorant of his own dimensions could ascertain the measure of anything else, or as if the human mind could see what the world itself cannot contain. All right? So this idea of exploring outer space and coming up with all kinds of theories about what exists outside the world, and if there are other planets and other life forms and other people in the... It's just foolishness. It's madness. It's not wisdom. It's not the pursuit of philosophy. It's not the pursuit of wisdom. It's foolishness. We can't even measure what we know. We can barely even visit other planets. and yet we're going to talk about what's beyond them, and what's beyond them, and what's beyond them, and everyone's going to act like they're one step smarter, and they know what's beyond them, and it just goes on and on and on. And we actually know, scientifically, we know very little about outer space. Very little. But when you listen to scientists, you'll think they've got everything figured out. But we know very little. We know very little about our own planet. We know very little about the oceans, about the mountains, about what's under the earth. We know very little. We know very little about ourselves. Modern scientists can't even tell what male and female means anymore. Now we think people can change their genders, or maybe somebody can be born with a male body, but they're actually a female, and later in their life they can choose to become... We don't even know what man is. And we're talking about planets and other worlds. It's just foolishness. So, to summarize chapter 1, which is lesson 1, where are we at time-wise?
41 minutes.
41, good. To summarize chapter 1, we see Pliny's view of the world, right? The title was An Account of the World. We're going to go on to talk about the form of the world and the elements in future chapters, but this opening chapter, we get a good look into the mind of Pliny. We get a good look into what Pliny thinks about the world. Remember, it's not just the earth. When he says world, he means the world and the heavens. Like when in Scripture we read, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens and the earth together are the mundus, the world. Okay? He didn't believe that the heavens and the earth were created, but he was not a Christian man. He lived when Christianity was just spreading into the world. He was a philosopher. He judged based on what he could observe and what reason led him to believe was probable or certain, just based on what could be known. And so he's not accountable necessarily to Christian knowledge like we are. He looked at the world and he saw something that was infinite, that was sacred, that seemed to have no limits, that seemed to be eternal, that was immeasurable. And that led him to have a certain view of man's life and what man should do and what man should study, what man should seek. And he said that this interest in things beyond the world is just madness. And so that explains why he would devote so much time and energy to studying the natural world, to studying the earth, to studying plants and animals. Because that's all we can know. Right? We can only know what's actually here, what God has actually given us to study. Right? There's a verse in the Old Testament, in the Bible. It says, the secret things belong to the Lord. In other words, anything that's mysterious and unknowable to us, that's God's business. But the things that have been revealed, they are for us. And you see, when you have that mindset, when you get out of this crazy mindset that wants to explore the universe and try to theorize about galaxies far, far away, when you get that out of your head, you realize what actually matters is what's here. This is the world God actually gave us to take care of. This is what we should be studying. This is what we're responsible for. I'm not responsible for the galaxies out there. I'm responsible for this little bit of land that I have to take care of. I'm responsible for my own life, my own body, my own family. There's no reason why I'm spending time dreaming about other galaxies and aliens and all this nonsense. It's just an excuse. It's an excuse to not mind your own business. And once we get that wisdom to know what our business is, we'll actually find that this world is really amazing and interesting, and there's plenty for us to study right here. And that leads to this whole book on natural history. Okay? So you can see, if you think there's other worlds, are you going to waste time learning about the plants in your own backyard or in the forest or other animals. You're going to be worried about whether an asteroid is going to come blow us up one day. But if you get all of that stuff out of your head and you realize what's here is what's real, and we need to study what's right here. We need to know what's around us, what's actually under our control, what we can order and influence. That's what we're responsible for. God made man to till the ground and keep it, to take care of the earth, to rule over the plants and animals. That's what we're made for. We're not made to be, outer space explorers. We can't even manage our own gardens, grow our own food. So Pliny brings our thoughts down to the earth, to this world we live in. And not just the earth, but also the heavens. He brings our minds down here where they belong so we can start to think reasonably and actually study things that are helpful. All right? So that's, I think, a good introduction to Pliny's Natural History and a walk through the first chapter. That's an end to lesson 1.